Hi, and welcome back to our Ask the Agronomist video series. I am Phil Long, Precision Agronomy Advisor with Latham High-Tech Seeds. And today, this week, we're going to be talking a little bit about a recap of 2021. So, kind of covering a smattering of pests that we may or may not have seen, or some things we thought maybe wouldn't show up but did, and talking about how that impacts going forward, not only into 2022 planning, but also 2023. So we'll see how well your memory is, but that's really critical when it comes to some of these pests, because when we're in rotation, maybe 2022 is not the year that it's critically important, but the following year might be. So let's just kind of go through some of these, and I'll talk through some of the ones that showed up. Maybe we didn't think they were going to show up, and we'll talk about some things that we can do and how we can remember going on into the future. So I want to start out and just kind of walk down through some of these, and I will say before we get started, 2021 was a tough year. It was maybe below average in terms of precipitation, so we were drier than we thought, and going into maybe seed fill period when we typically think about a fungicide, we weren't quite as worried. We thought, some of these diseases won't show up. However, they still did show up. Things like gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight were still out there, not as high of incidence or not as severe, I'd say, but still did show up in a lot of cornfields throughout Latham country. And these two diseases in particular, a lot of times we try to think about, okay, what are the scenarios where this disease may show up worse. Well, a lot of times it doesn't take that much moisture, and in these two particular and a lot of other diseases, it may just be 6 to 8 hours of leaf wetness, and it doesn't take much to get that. A lot of times we get that overnight. We have the wetness on the leaf and maybe it doesn't go away, or we don't have a lot of wind or a lot of heat early on in the day that's pushing through the canopy and drying those leaves up. So you get a lot of moisture sitting on the leaves, and that allows that fungus or pathogen to continue to grow and to spread. So those two were still showing up. The third one I'm going to mention is tar spot. I'm not going to talk a lot about it because we're going to do a future video on that. But tar spot is one that was showing up. It showed up a little later in the season and continues, it seems like year after year now, to be continuing repetitive offender, I'll say, that just keeps coming back. So it's going to be something we have to deal with. In some years it's going to be much worse than others. This year it didn't seem quite as bad, but it still came in and still allowed other infections to come into the plant and maybe senesce a little bit early. Any of these diseases can really harbor or allow other diseases or other pests to show up, and that's sometimes we get caught up. We see one thing on a leaf, and maybe there's just northern corn leaf blight or gray leaf spot on the leaf, but a lot of times there's more than one pest, and sometimes even insects really zone in. They get that, they can sense that. The crop gives off a kind of stress signal, and they'll come in and attack as well. So we end up with multiple angles of attack, and sometimes we do end up needing things like fungicides and insecticides to really help protect that yield. The other one I'll mention for those up north in Latham country is Gossis wilt. Was definitely still showing up. This is one that typically comes in after infections or wounds, bacterial infections. So a lot of times it's wind or hail or something like that. It opens up the plant and allows Gossis wilt to come in, and it's obviously there in the residue too. And a lot of these diseases that we have remain in the residue, and sometimes they can remain in the residue for long periods of time. A lot of times we think, we'll do some tillage this fall, we'll eliminate the issue. But especially things like northern corn leaf blight, they've known, researchers have seen that it can stay well over a year even. So even if you're a corn soybean rotation, it's still going to show up in there 2 years later and can potentially reinfect the plant given the right conditions. So don't think you're out of the woods if you're on a corn soybean rotation. Obviously it's going to be much higher pressure if you're in a continuous corn rotation, but still allows still opportunity for it out there even if you're in rotation. The next one I'm going to mention is rust, common rust, southern rust for the southern part of Latham country, but common rust as well was pretty common this year, especially with the dry conditions. Showed up in a lot of places and kind of took over, but typically that's not one that's highly economically impactful but still definitely was out there. And the last one I'm going to mention, I said pests when we started. I've been talking mainly about diseases, but I have to mention it because it's been a hot topic the last few years, and that's corn rootworm. And corn rootworm was really bad in a lot of areas. We're continuing to track corn rootworm and where it goes. We'll share that as much as we can as far as the distribution maps and so forth. But corn rootworm has been one that's kind of continuously building up. Hopefully next season is not as bad, but we have to prepare for what we've been seeing. And what we've been seeing is very high populations out there. It seemed like it was everywhere in corn and soybean fields and our gardens, and they were everywhere until the first frost. So we have to believe that there was pretty high populations out there. So unless something drastic happens over the winter, we need to be prepared for that. So what are some of the things that we can do to maybe mitigate this or plan ahead for it? The first thing I'd say is like I mentioned early on, we got to plan really for 2023. So we may be thinking about 2022 right now and spring planning for that, but maybe your rotation is 50-50 corn, soybeans, and you're not that worried about, maybe a corn disease that was out there in your cornfield because it's going to be soybeans next year. Well, you need to plan ahead for 2 years down the road, because by then you're probably going to forget. So whether you're using something like our Data Forward app, which is a great app to easily drop a pin and it's there forever, you can go back and look in that particular year and look back when you're planning for those years and see, okay, where was it at? Maybe you walked out in the field before a fungicide application and you saw it. You can drop a pin. There's even a ability within the Data Forward app to make a circle around it. If you're looking at imagery and you see that there's a tough spot and you know it's related to a particular disease, you could draw a circle around that area and mark it so you know years down the road that was a tough spot for northern corn leaf blight or whatever it was. So planning ahead really is the key. And then in order to plan ahead, we have things like our product guide. Obviously, I have here on the bottom of every page in our corn hybrids, we have the agronomic characteristics as well as disease resistance in here. And we discuss the traits, obviously, for corn rootworm. So a lot of great tools here to really help you select better products, whether that's going forward, like I mentioned, into 2022 or planning next fall for 2023. So we got to keep these things in mind, because if we forget, then we've kind of walked backwards. So planning is the first thing, and then making plans to succeed is the next. So I just want to mention a couple quick things, and one is tillage, since we're in the fall. So the one thing I'd say about tillage is a lot of times we think if we're doing continuous corn or something, we can just bury the residue, and it'll work really well. Well, that disease still typically shows up unless you're doing something like moldboard plow and completely burying the residue and getting it completely submerged so that it can break down. It's still going to be there in the residue, and there's still going to be pathogens present for next season. So remember whether you're trying to do tillage and bury it, or just sizing with something like vertical tillage or something in the fall, that's a great way to manage residue, but it doesn't necessarily get rid of the pathogen prevalence in the field. The other thing I'd mention, we don't talk about this a lot in terms of pests and diseases, but that's host crops. Obviously, corn and soybeans are host crops to the diseases that affect them, but we don't think a lot about the weeds that are out there. So this time of the year, we're also dealing with fertilizer prices and herbicides that are hard to get a hold of, so we need to keep these things in mind. And herbicides is one that I'd say as we're moving into the fall here and early spring, especially if you're no-till, controlling some of these weeds in the late fall and early spring can really help reduce some of the diseases that are out there. One thing I think about a lot of times for host crops is soybean cyst nematode, field pennycress, and many other weeds that we have, including some cover crops, clovers and so forth, can carry that pest on and help it keep going. But when it comes to diseases, there's a lot of grass crops like foxtail and other things, chickweeds and other things in the winter annuals that also carry those diseases forward. So just remember that, we have to keep our eye and ears tuned into everything really that's going to help our crop succeed. And that's the last thing I'd say, is just really planning for success. So whether you do a fungicide every year, I don't necessarily advocate that, but planning for success may mean making sure you go out there and scout and take those notes whether to make that fungicide application. We have a lot of fungicides nowadays. They can last 30 plus 35 days, which is great. A great opportunity to spray that and get good control or suppression over that time period. But you have to be aware of that, and you have to know what's going on out in your field. So being out scouting and planning for success is really critically important. So thanks again for watching. We welcome any questions on our social media platforms. We'll look forward to seeing you next time.